At the heart of Beccaриa's classical school of thought was the notion that it is better to prevent crimes than to punish them. Out of this idea arises our understanding, or the common understanding, of deterrence, and the idea that it is better to let a guilty man go free than to punish an innocent man. Beccaria did not question the need for punishment, but he believed that laws should be designed to prevent or to preserve public safety and public order, not to avenge crime. And to ensure a rational and fair penal structure, punishments for specific crimes must be decreed by written criminal codes, and that judges' discretionary powers should be strictly curtailed. Deterrence, according to Beccaria, deterrence employs the threat of punishment to influence behavior, and it's assumed that people are rational. People's behavior is the product of free will. People's goal is to increase pleasure and to avoid pain. And three principles of punishment that became the hallmark of Beccaria's classical deterrence doctrine are swift, certain, and severe. Punishment should be swift, certain, and severe. I'll circle back to this, but generally swift. The punishment must be swift to be effective. You can't have the punishment linger, or the punishment and the crime, or the punishment and the crime, they lose their association. It has to be certain. People must know they will be punished for their illegal behavior. You can't have people evade the law for any reason. And it has to be severe. Must be severe enough to outweigh the rewards of the illegal action. Severity and proportionality are sometimes at odds, especially since each person is different in terms of what constitutes a severe punishment. Proportionate, to the harm caused. If we lose proportionality, there's little to prevent or discourage the criminal from committing more severe crimes and engaging in worse behavior. And I gave this example earlier. If somebody's punishment for rape is the death penalty, then what stops the rapist from killing the victim? They have nothing to lose. So proportionality. So not only does the chance of being punished influence one's decision to commit a crime, but also the perception that punishment will almost certainly happen if they do commit a crime, and that influences the decision to commit a crime. The greater the perception of punishment, the more unlikely a crime will be committed. However, the likelihood of being caught has little effect on crime if criminals believe that the likelihood of getting caught is small. So the perception on deterrence is not universal among individuals. The more seasoned criminal may be harder to deter, especially if they've gotten away with it before. Another assumption, marginal choice theory, is the concept of marginal deterrence, and it's based on the belief that it is prudent to punish a more severe crime more severely than a lesser crime, and a series of crimes more severely than a single crime. The assumption here is that more severe penalties would deter criminals from committing more serious acts, and so there is a marginal gain. The example that is used in the book, it's a good example, I'm going to use it here. If police are called to a domestic violence incident, sometimes they make an arrest, and sometimes they give the offender a warning. If making the arrest reduces the chances of reoffending versus getting a warning, the arrest is said to produce a higher marginal deterrent effect. May not eliminate the future offending, but provides a better outcome. So it relates to the effectiveness. Restrictive deterrence, on the other hand, refers to situations in which the threat of punishment can reduce, but not eliminate the crime. And the book uses speeding. Speeding's a perfect example of this. Stiffer penalty if you're going 20 miles an hour over the limit. It may prevent people from going 20 miles an hour over the limit, but still speeding if they're going 10 miles an hour over the limit. And that's exactly how the law works for speeding. 30 mile an hour, 40 mile, the more miles per hour you're going over the speed limit, the stiffer the penalty. And if you are going 100 on the highway, chances are pretty good you can lose your license. So the penalty gets worse as speed increases. As I said a little while ago, the three principles of punishment: swift, certain, severe. Swift, punishment must be swift to be effective. You can't have the punishment linger. Certain, people must know that they will be punished for any illegal behavior. And severe, must be severe enough to outweigh the rewards of the illegal action. And it is commonly assumed that increasing the severity of punishment increases potential pain or cost of committing a crime and should therefore make offending less likely. One of the simplest methods to increase the severity is to impose a longer prison term for a particular crime. However, there are limits on how severe a punishment can be imposed because of that principle that I mentioned earlier, proportionality. The severity of the punishment should be roughly proportionate to the gravity of the offense. However, research shows that most systematic reviews of the effects of sentencing severity on crime, with a couple exceptions, that there is little or no evidence that increasing the punitiveness of criminal sanctions exerts an effect on offending. This is partly because many offenders get used to being in prison, with the result that longer sentences are not necessarily perceived as being more severe than shorter sentences. Criminologists have found that enhancing the certainty of punishment produces a stronger deterrent effect than increasing the severity of the punishment. Offenders who perceive that sanctions for particular crimes are almost inevitable are less likely to engage in criminal activity. However, because unfortunately low apprehension rates in most criminal justice systems, in practice it's much easier to make the penalties more severe than it is to make them more certain. And swiftness, just review swiftness. You can't have the punishment linger, or the punishment and the crime, they lose their association. The lag time in court systems due to delays, the time from when a crime is committed to when the trial happens and then the potential sentence, especially if the sentence is the death sentence, can be great. There's a long lag time, sometimes 12 plus years for a capital case where the death penalty is involved. And this causes a loss in the effectiveness of crime deterrence. Let's talk about death penalty for a moment. Does the death penalty discourage murder? There's a passage in the book relative to the death penalty. The death penalty is still retained in some countries, about 57, I believe, 54, 57 countries, and that includes the United States. And it's due to the perception that it is a potent deterrent for the most serious offenses. And research was done in the 70s on the death penalty, claimed that the death penalty was effective as a great deterrent and that each execution led to 7 or 8 fewer homicides in society. But more recent research has failed to find those effects. A major difficulty in evaluating the effectiveness of the death penalty as a deterrent in the United States is that very few people are actually executed. And criminologist Dr. Fagan stated that the rare and somewhat arbitrary use of execution in states, those ones that still recognize the death penalty anyway, means that it serves no deterrent function because no would-be murderer can reasonably expect to be executed. It takes a long time. There's the appeal process and so forth. So I'll let you review that passage on the death penalty. That concludes the discussion on general deterrence, which focuses on society as a whole, deterring society as a whole in committing crimes. And we're going to switch gears and talk. Actually, one more point I want to bring up with regards to deterrence is, I didn't flip my screen. Certainty, severity, swiftness, I just went through that. Evaluating general deterrence. What are the limits of deterrence? There are some practical limits on deterrence. The penalties for committing various crimes are often learned after the arrest, which means the offender was not dissuaded by fear of punishment because they really had no idea what the consequences were for their actions. Many offenders simply underestimate their own risk of being caught, and they assume that they will get away with it. In this instance, the cost-benefit analysis is not being accurately evaluated, and the criminal is overly confident that they will get away with crime. Clearance rates are generally low for a wide variety of crimes, which sends the message that some criminals, that their chances of getting caught are slim. Not as slim as they often think, fortunately, but slim nonetheless. Crime displacement may occur, where deterrence practices simply moves crime from one area to another in a community. Rational abilities may be impaired in some individuals, which undermines the effects of deterrent practices. Impulsive youth, are prone to irrationality, and it might matter very little what the deterrents were. They were going to commit the crime regardless. Example of things that might lead to impaired rational abilities include drugs, alcohol, heat of passion, mental disorders. Finally, plain and simple, regardless of the potential punishments for a crime and the deterrent strategies involved, some people have little to lose and are willing to do anything to change their situation. So now that is the end of our discussion on general deterrence. As I said, that is deterring the community as a whole, people as a whole, with regards to specific deterrence, which we're going to turn down next to. Specific deterrence focuses on the offender. What is, by giving a severe punishment to a offender, will that deter that offender from committing crimes in the future, repeat offending?